Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you having the hearing today. And Secretary Ross, good to have you back. You guys have been busy, clearly. As you know, I'm supportive of cracking down on China. I think it's necessary. I think we've tried in the past, has not been successful, and my hope is we'll have more success. We have to be careful about an escalation there. I also support what we're doing with regard to a better NAFTA accord. We need NAFTA. We need it badly, but we have to be sure that it's updated. I also believe in level the playing field on trade generally, and I'm the author of the Level the Playing Field Act with Senator Brown. We've been winning cases consistently, including steel cases, because of unfair trade dumping and subsidies. My concern is 232, and you and I have talked about this.
Yes, sir.
It's a very extraordinary remedy that ought to be used very carefully and very selectively. And it ought to be used for national security reasons, which is why it was drafted. Frankly, my concern is the way we're using it now, it's both misusing it and having negative economic impacts in certain sectors, but also I think it risks us not having this tool in the future. Because although the WTO has not yet adjudicated this case, if we're pushing the envelope beyond national security, I think we lose a tool that could be very important for us in a true national security situation. Deeply concerned about its application to Canada, as an example, our #1 export market from Ohio, the country's #1 export market. Mexico, the EU, I don't see the national security perspective there. And I've looked back, to try to figure out, well, what did we mean back in the 60s we came up with this bill? It's only been used, as you know, a few times. It hasn't been used in over 30 years.
Right.
George Bush tried to use it, and his Secretary of Commerce said it's not a national security concern with regard to steel, so he had to use another measure. It doesn't require any surge. It doesn't require any showing of material injury. So it's very unusual in terms of our trade laws and ought to be used for national security concerns. When you look back at the then chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, what he said, he talked about, this needs to be used to be sure we're helping our allies, not hurting them. He said any modification of a duty on imports would inevitably result in a curtailment of exports, could be a burden on the domestic industry, would not only be a burden on domestic industry in economic disadvantage, also be a disadvantage to national security. So that was the thought here. This would be very narrow. And speaking of damages, Ohio, as you know, is disproportionately hit. We're hit harder than any other state by the Canadian retaliatory tariffs, as an example, because of 232. So I get your argument that we have a global glut of steel. I agree with that. China is the reason. 15 years ago, they had about 15% of production. Now they have about 50% of the world's production. They don't need it. They're sending it out at below its cost. That's dumping. That's why we're winning these cases, including a almost 300% tariff on some of the rolled product from China today. I believe that the Enforce Act ought to be used much more aggressively. This is something I worked on with Senator Wyden and others on this committee. It's in law to stop these transshipments where China sends its product to one country and then ends up coming to us. We're not enforcing it in the way we should, and Customs and Border Protection has a huge role to play there. I think with regard to Canada and Mexico, there's a solution that we ought to be looking to. One, the Enforce Act, if you see a problem. Two, let's measure transshipment. My understanding is we don't know to the extent there's any transshipment. We're not even accusing them of that. We're certainly not accusing them of any unfair trade practices. But if that's true, let's have a trigger in place where, should that happen, we can react. It seems like that would be a very appropriate part of the NAFTA negotiations. How would you feel about such an approach, where we could measure transshipments and then have a trigger in a NAFTA as compared to using 232, this blunt instrument?
Well, at present, there is no measurement being conducted because Customs and Border aren't very interested in things that are shipped between two countries that have no tariff to each other. So we simply do not have definitive data as to what's going on in the way of transshipment from China through Canada. We have seen all kinds of transshipment with or without slight modification of product going on to get around the existing enforcement actions we've taken. You're well aware we have some 440 trade actions in force, including the one we just put in on the welded large diameter pipe, mostly against China. But what happens is they'll make the WTO rules, as you're well aware as former U.S. trade rep, require great specificity as to product and origin. So if they make a small modification, A steel bar like this, if they put a little tiny flange on it, we have to start all over.
I would just say, Mr. Secretary, and I appreciate your response, that's why we wrote the Enforce Act, precisely to be able to get at those kinds of situations. And I understand you're saying that Customs and Border Protection doesn't prioritize this issue as much as you would like them to, apparently. We agree. That's why we wrote the law. So it seems to me, before we take these extraordinary actions and really risk the possibility of using 232 in the future, in my view, because I think the next time it's before the WTO, it's going to be very problematic for us, given the way we're using it without any national security connection. Let me go on to another one, which is automobiles. What's the basis for a national security concern with regard to automobiles?
Well, we're at the early stages of the investigation on the auto industry, so we clearly don't have conclusions. There are a few things that, however, that we are very concerned about, one of which is the automotive trade deficit that we have been experiencing. If you look at the overall trade deficit of the, and we're going to put up a chart to show you why we think it's so important and so dramatic. The blue bars, the vertical ones, are the amount of trade deficit each year. And you'll see that starting about 1985, we had small trade deficits in autos. Now we have quite huge one, pushing 140 billion a year. We have a similar one in auto parts.
Let me just say, because I'm over my time, and I apologize, wish we had more time. Maybe we can do a second round. I know you have to leave also, but my point is not that we don't have a need to balance trade. It is what tools we use. And if you use 232, which look back at the legislative history, it has only been used 3 times since the 1960s when it was written. It hasn't been used in over 30 years because other commerce departments have said this is not a national security concern. I do think that you risk not only these huge retaliatory tariffs that will be upheld, but by the way, our auto industry now is the #1 exporter in America.
Right.
Cars and auto parts, the #1 exporter. So losing those export markets is a big deal to the auto companies as well. It's also a highly integrated industry, as you well know,
Surely.
given your background.
Surely.
And so the supply chains are complicated, but they're international. So they're very concerned. I just hope that, Ms. Secretary, that we continue to make progress on level that playing field, reciprocity, but doing it with the tools we have at our disposal that deal with unfair trade, deal with surges, that deal with countries that dump, deal with countries that subsidize, and be very, very cautious in terms of how we extend beyond that, because I think that will end up hurting our workers and our economy. And I thank you for being here today. I look forward to continuing to work with you on this.
Well, thanks.
Thank you very much, Senator.